We used to call her the Queen of Bingo. My grandmother, Nanny Woods, she didn't just play bingo, she lived bingo. Now, it wasn't always that way. My grandmother and grandfather, they worked very hard to raise and feed their 6 children in a small row house in the Philadelphia suburbs. They didn't have much money. They didn't have much at all. And so they both worked very hard through most of their adult lives, and they raised their children and taught them faith. But finally, when it came time for both of them to retire, they could each find ways to enjoy themselves. For my grandfather, that meant going out and buying a luxurious reclining chair that he could put right in front of that big old Zenith television in the front living room, where he could watch the Philadelphia Phillies lose yet another baseball game. Even in the presence of the grandchildren, he sometimes used some peppery language depending on what was happening in the ball game. And my grandmother, well, she became the Queen of Bingo. She went Monday nights to a local church to play bingo, and on Tuesday night she went to the volunteer fire company. And on Wednesday night, she even went to the synagogue to play bingo there. She loved meeting her friends. She loved having a snack with the ladies in the kitchen. She loved her evenings out. She became the Queen of Bingo. Now, sadly, her bingo playing came to an abrupt end in 1982 when my grandfather had a series of strokes that left him paralyzed on the left side of his body. He could no longer walk. He just didn't have the mobility. He couldn't speak, and he couldn't swallow. So the doctors inserted a feeding tube into his stomach, and they told my grandmother that she should find a nursing home where my grandfather could be cared for. But she was hearing none of that. She announced at the hospital that she was going to take him home and learn to care for him there, because that's what you do. And that's what she did. So the comfortable reclining chair went out of the living room and was replaced by a hospital bed. The television was still there. But my grandmother had to learn a whole new set of skills so that she could become the caregiver for her husband, who was now paralyzed on one side and unable to speak. He still watched the baseball games, but he could no longer yell at the Phillies when they were losing. My grandmother even had to learn how to feed my grandfather through that feeding tube. It was a green liquid food. The grandkids called it the green goop. We didn't know what else to call it. They settled into what had become the new normal for them. That little row house where they were living was not far from where I was now enrolled in college. And I remember one Friday afternoon, I was driving home to see my parents. I decided to stop in to see my grandmother and grandfather. I parked my car on the street and walked across the old front porch and pulled open the squeaky screen door. And I don't know if you've ever had the experience of walking into a room and you know something's wrong in the room, but you don't know what's wrong yet. And that was the experience I had. I walked into that front living room and I could tell something was wrong. But then my eyes adjusted to the light and I could see what the problem was. My grandfather was there in that hospital bed and his face was red and he was gesturing with the hand that still worked. And my grandmother was kind of standing over him at the bed, flustered and trying to move things around. And I could see the problem. The green goop had gone everywhere. Something had gone wrong in the feeding process, and the liquid was all over my grandfather in the bed, and he was flustered and she was crying. And I was a 19-year-old male, so my first instinct was, step out of this room. So I put my hand on the screen door and started to push it open, but I forgot that it was squeaky. And maybe it was the squeak of the screen door that made my grandmother aware of my presence for the first time in that moment. And she looked at me, and my grandmother, who had never raised her voice to me, she said to me, "Don't you dare." And then she repeated herself. She said, "Don't you dare leave." And I just froze because I didn't know what was going to come next. And she said, "Don't you dare leave, because sometimes love looks like this. Sometimes love looks like this." And she was right. I've been preaching for 23 years now. And as a preacher, I get called on many times to preach about love. And I must confess to you that I love it when love looks lovely. I love it when love looks like a parent holding their child, their newborn child, for the first time. I love it when love looks like a bride and groom standing before the altar on the wedding day. I love it when love looks like that couple at my church. They're married 66 years this year. They hold each other's hands in the parking lot as they come into church, not because they're afraid they're going to fall over, but because they're still that much in love. I love it when love looks like the grandparents at my congregation, whose faces are beaming because their grandchild is up there singing in the Christmas pageant. I love it when love looks lovely. But those of you who have ever tried to love for a lifetime, who've ever tried to love authentically, who've ever tried to love in a Christ-like way, you know that love does not always look like that, does it? It doesn't always look like the parent holding the newborn for the first time, because that newborn grows up, and now that child is 3 and has a terrible cough and can't sleep, and it's 3 in the morning, and an exhausted mother who just wants to go to sleep herself is sitting next to that child, rubbing that child's back, because that's the only way to give them comfort. And that's what love looks like. Or that child then grows up and now she's 17 and you told her to be home at 10 o'clock and now it's 11:35 and she's not home yet. And you're sitting on the couch frightened. Where is she? And is she okay? Sometimes love looks like waiting, doesn't it? Sometimes love looks like patience. Sometimes love looks like getting up early in the morning even though you still want to sleep because somebody has to make the sandwiches, and so you do. Sometimes love looks like starting over, or just getting through the day, or being willing to forgive yet again. And sometimes love looks like a 70-year-old woman cleaning up the green goop that has spilled on her husband. Who is it that taught you what love really looks like in life? Who is it, by their example, by their authenticity, by the way they live their life, who is it that has taught you what real love, authentic love, Christ-like love looks like? Perhaps this week in your prayer, you could spend some time thanking God for those people who have taught you what love truly looks like. When Jesus calls us to love one another, he is calling us to a demanding vocation. When God called the prophets, like the prophet Jeremiah, God asked them to love people enough to tell people the truth. And when St. Paul wrote his magnificent and poetic hymn about love that we read in the first letter to the Corinthians, he knew that the greatest icon, the greatest image of what love truly looks like is Jesus Christ on the cross, where Jesus gave everything to show us his love. Look at Christ on the cross. That's what love looks like. When St. Paul tells us in the first letter to the Corinthians that love never fails, he's not talking about our feelings, because feelings fail. And he's not talking about lust, because that comes and goes. And he's not talking about infatuations. They fade. Paul was talking about the kind of love whereby you and I wake up every morning and we decide We decide to do what is right. We decide to do what is just. We decide to do what is generous for one another, not because we're going to receive anything in return, not because we're going to get recognition, but because it is the right and generous and Christ-like thing to do. And we do it even when we don't feel like it. Listen again, please. St. Paul tells us in the first letter to the Corinthians what Christian love looks like. He says, love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It's not irritable or resentful. Love does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. Now, I don't know about you, but when I read those words from St. Paul, I shudder. I shudder because I know that my love does not always look like that. St. Paul tells me that Christian love forgives everything, endures everything, is patient with everyone. Well, my love is not quite there yet. I need to know what love looks like, and I thank God that St. Paul gives me that description. But I must also confess that my love doesn't always look like that in day-to-day life. And that's precisely why we need to stay focused on Jesus Christ. In today's gospel reading, Jesus is in Nazareth, his hometown. He had grown up there. People had watched him grow. They watched him fall and scrape his knee. They watched him on the days when he didn't feel so well, and maybe when he got into some trouble and Mary and Joseph had to correct him. They'd watched him learn. They'd watched him worship. And it was there, in his hometown, that Jesus announces that he has come to fulfill the prophetic promises that God gave us in the Old Testament. That prophetic promise of Isaiah, he has come to bring glad tidings to the poor, liberty to captives, freedom for the oppressed. The year of favor from God is now. Jesus, in his own life and ministry, was answering the age-old question, what does God's love look like? Well, it turns out that God's love looks like compassion and inclusion, tenderness and attention for the outcast. God's love looks like forgiveness for the sinner and welcome for the stranger. This is what God's love looks like, shining through the person of his Son, Jesus. But the folks in Jesus' hometown are not quite sure that they want God's love to look like that. And they're not quite sure that they want God's loving servant to look so much like Jesus, like this boy who had grown up in their midst, like this boy who looked so much like everyone else. So many people in the time of Jesus and now want God's love to look like our imperfect love, limited and delineated and controlled. They want God's love to look like our love, a love that's given to some but not to others, so that some are in and some are out, and some are hated and some are included. But here is Jesus both saying and showing that God's love is for all and offered to all and available to all in ways that break down the walls that we build to divide people. And some of the townsfolk in Nazareth conclude, we don't want God's love to look like that, and we don't want God's love to look like him. As Jesus discovers in today's gospel passage, and as he will ultimately discover on the cross of Calvary, the world does not always do well with people who love this authentically and this universally. He is rejected, he is condemned, and on the cross he pays the price to show us what his Father's love looks like. When love breaks our hearts, when love costs us something, we need to remember what I saw in my grandparents' front room. We need to remember what we see every time we look at Jesus on the cross. Sometimes love looks like this. And I wonder what would happen if we Christians really took Jesus and St. Paul at their word and started, with the help of God's grace, to love each other with a fierce and faithful Christian love. What would happen if we focus on the cross and say to ourselves, yes, sometimes love, even my love, is going to look like that and feel like that in my life. And I am willing to pay a price so that my love will never fail. What would happen if spouses really said to each other, my love for you will forgive all things and hope all things and endure all things? What would happen if parents said to children, I will make loving you my highest priority, no matter what that may cost? What would happen if friends really were willing to pay any price to faithfully care for each other? Because they know that St. Paul is right when he says, without love I am nothing. What would happen if Christian leaders, if the leaders of every Christian church made their daily decisions based on one goal, that our every action might reveal Christ's love for God's people and lead God's people ever more deeply into the heart of Christ's love? What would happen if liberal politicians learned to love unborn children as much as they love poor children? And what would happen if conservative politicians learned to love immigrant children as much as they say they love unborn children? And what would happen to nations and political groups if we all listened to Jesus when he says, love your neighbor as yourself? What could love look like in your life? Could it look like you feeding the hungry, or clothing the naked, or visiting the lonely? Could it look like you working for justice, welcoming the stranger and the alien among us, caring for the good earth that God has given all of us? Could it look like your daily decision to live more simply so that others might simply live? Could love look like you cleaning up the green goop that has spilled? In the life of Jesus, love always looks like a willingness to stoop down low enough to serve and to wash feet. And on the cross, love looked like the willingness to give everything for the ones that you love. Love looks like sacrifice and service. Always, 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 love looks like Jesus. Sometimes, love looks like us. May the Lord be praised now and forever. Amen.